In 1993, a 7-year-old boy from a small town in rural Ohio vanished without a trace during his own birthday party. The afternoon sun cast playful shadows across the backyard as Timothy Chen blew out the candles on his teenage mutant ninja turtles cake surrounded by 12 classmates and their watchful parents. The sound of children's laughter mixed with the distant hum of lawnmowers and the gentle rustle of oak leaves overhead, creating the perfect soundtrack for what should have been an unforgettable celebration. His mother, Linda, had just stepped inside to refill the punch bowl when the screaming started. High-pitched, panicked voices calling Timothy's name from every corner of the yard. Within minutes, the festive atmosphere shattered into chaos as parents frantically searched behind every bush, under every deck chair, and through the small storage shed where Timothy often played hide-and-seek. 28 years later, Detective Michael Chen sat in his patrol car outside the house where his younger brother had disappeared, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The yellow Victorian home looked smaller now, its paint faded and peeling, with overgrown ivy creeping up the sides like gnarled fingers reaching toward forgotten memories. He'd driven past this place countless times over the years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, he was here because of Eleanor Hartwell's phone call, the voice trembling with age and something deeper, something that sounded like decades of buried guilt. The 82-year-old woman who lived in the house directly behind their old backyard had whispered words that made his blood run cold. "I saw something that day, Michael. Something I should have told someone 30 years ago." The weight of his badge felt heavier than usual as Michael walked up the cracked sidewalk to Mrs. Hartwell's front door, each step echoing with the ghosts of birthday parties and summer afternoons that would never come again. His parents had moved away 5 years after Timothy's disappearance, unable to bear the constant reminder of their lost son. But Michael had stayed, becoming a cop in the same town where he'd failed to protect his little brother. The official investigation had concluded that Timothy had wandered into the dense woods behind the neighborhood and gotten lost, despite the fact that bloodhounds had found no scent trail, and 3 days of searching had yielded nothing but false hopes and broken hearts. Now, as autumn leaves crunched beneath his feet, and the evening air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, Michael wondered if the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along, just beyond the chain-link fence that separated their childhood from the secrets next door. The porch light flickered as he knocked, and through the lace curtains he could see Mrs. Hartwell's silhouette moving slowly toward the door, her walker tapping against the hardwood floor with each careful step. She'd been a fixture in the neighborhood for over 50 years, the kind of elderly woman who knew everyone's business but kept it to herself, always ready with homemade cookies and a listening ear for troubled children. Michael remembered her as the lady who gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween, and never complained when his friends cut through her yard to reach the creek behind the houses. But tonight, as the door creaked open and he saw the deep lines of worry etched into her weathered face, he realized that Eleanor Hartwell had been carrying a burden that had aged her far beyond her years. "I've been waiting for you to come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stepped aside to let him in. The living room smelled of lavender and old books, with family photographs covering every available surface, and a grandfather clock ticking away the seconds with methodical precision. Mrs. Hartwell settled into her favorite armchair, her arthritic hands folded in her lap, and Michael could see the way her fingers trembled as she prepared to unlock a secret that had been eating away at her soul for nearly 3 decades. "I should have called the police that day, but I was afraid. And then so much time passed, and I convinced myself that maybe what I saw wasn't real, that maybe my old eyes were playing tricks on me." Her words hung in the air like smoke, and Michael felt his chest tighten as he realized that everything he'd believed about his brother's disappearance was about to change forever. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times as Mrs. Hartwell reached for a small wooden box on the side table, her movements deliberate and weighted with the gravity of 3 decades worth of silence. Inside the box, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay a small red baseball cap with a Superman logo, the same cap Timothy had been wearing on the day he vanished. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the faded fabric, remembering how his brother had worn it everywhere, even to bed sometimes, claiming it gave him superpowers. "I found this caught on my rose bush the morning after the party," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It was hanging there like a flag, and I knew it meant something terrible had happened, but I was too scared to face what it might mean." The cap felt impossibly light in Michael's hands, yet it carried the weight of all the sleepless nights, all the unanswered prayers, all the birthdays that had passed without Timothy's laughter echoing through the house. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with tears as she began to recount the events of that September afternoon, her words painting a picture that had haunted her dreams for 28 years. She'd been in her kitchen, preparing dinner and watching the birthday party through her window, when she noticed a man she didn't recognize standing at the edge of the woods, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. He was wearing dark clothing, and he had this way of watching the children that made my skin crawl, she whispered, her hands clutching a crumpled tissue. I saw him gesture to Timothy, saw your brother walk toward the trees, and then they both just disappeared. The old woman's voice broke as she described how she'd waited for Timothy to come back, how she'd convinced herself that maybe he'd just gone exploring, how she'd watched the search parties from her bedroom window and never found the courage to speak up. The guilt had eaten away at her like a cancer, she said, growing stronger with each passing year, each birthday that went uncelebrated, each Christmas that felt incomplete. Michael felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to become a police officer, the same fury that had sustained him through years of following cold leads and chasing shadows. But now the anger was mixed with something else, a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, the case wasn't as cold as everyone believed. He pulled out his notepad and began asking the questions he'd been trained to ask, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside his chest. Can you describe this man? How tall was he? What was he wearing? Did you see which direction they went? Mrs. Hartwell closed her eyes, concentrating with the intensity of someone trying to resurrect a memory that had been buried beneath decades of guilt and fear. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a black jacket, I think, and jeans. And Michael... She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. I think he knew exactly which child he was looking for. The implications of her words hit Michael like a physical blow, and he felt the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. If Mrs. Hartwell was right, if Timothy's disappearance hadn't been random, then someone had been watching their family, studying their routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The birthday party would have been ideal. A house full of distracted adults, children running freely around the yard, and the natural chaos that comes with 12 7-year-olds hopped up on sugar and excitement. Michael's mind raced through the possibilities, wondering who might have had access to information about the party, who might have known the layout of their backyard, who might have had reason to target his innocent little brother. Mrs. Hartwell, I need you to think carefully. In the days or weeks before the party, did you notice anyone unusual in the neighborhood? Anyone asking questions about our family or watching the house? The old woman's face grew pale as she considered his question, and Michael could see the wheels turning in her mind as she sifted through 3 decades of memories. There was someone, she said slowly, her voice gaining strength as the details began to emerge. A man who came by a few times, said he was from the church doing a survey about community involvement. He asked a lot of questions about the families in the neighborhood, especially families with young children. She paused, her eyes growing wide with the dawning realization of what she might have witnessed. He had a clipboard and everything, seemed very official, but something about him didn't feel right. I remember thinking he was too interested in the details, what time the children got home from school, whether the parents worked, which houses had fenced yards. Michael felt his pulse quicken as he realized they might finally have their first real lead, the thread that could unravel the mystery that had defined his entire adult life. The next morning, Michael stood in the basement of the police station, surrounded by boxes of evidence from Timothy's case that hadn't been opened in over a decade. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor, as he methodically sorted through witness statements, photographs, and reports that had once represented the entire focus of his world. Among the yellowed papers, he found what he was looking for: a mention of a church survey that had been conducted in their neighborhood 3 weeks before Timothy's disappearance. The report was brief, barely a paragraph, noting that several residents had mentioned a man asking questions about local families. But the lead had been dismissed when no one from any of the local churches claimed to have authorized such a survey. Michael's hands trembled as he read the description provided by another neighbor. Tall, dark-haired, beard, professional demeanor, clipboard, asking specifically about children's schedules. Father Miguel Santos had been the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church for 35 years, and his office reflected the decades of service with its walls covered in children's artwork, thank you cards, and photographs of baptisms, confirmations, and weddings. Michael found him sitting behind a desk cluttered with sermon notes and community outreach plans, his weathered hands folded in prayer as he finished his morning devotions. "Detective Chen," the priest said, rising to greet him, with a warm smile that faded when he saw the serious expression on Michael's face. "I've been expecting someone to come see me eventually. 28 years is a long time to carry a secret, but I suppose some secrets are too heavy for one person to bear alone." The admission hung in the air between them, and Michael felt his world tilt slightly as he realized that Mrs. Hartwell wasn't the only one who had been hiding something about his brother's disappearance. Father Santos moved to a locked filing cabinet in the corner of his office, his movements slow and deliberate as he retrieved a manila folder that looked like it had been handled countless times over the years. His name was David Brennan, and he came to me 3 days after Timothy disappeared, claiming he wanted to confess to something that might be related to the case, the priest said, his voice heavy with the weight of the confessional seal. "I told him that if he had information about a crime, he needed to go to the police, but he insisted that he needed spiritual guidance first." Michael's jaw clenched as he listened to the story unfold, understanding now why the investigation had stalled. The one person who might have had crucial information had hidden behind the sanctity of the confessional, and the priest had been bound by his vows to keep the secret. He was tormented, Detective. I've heard many confessions in my time, but I've never seen a man so consumed by guilt and fear. The file contained a name, an address from 1993, and a photograph that Father Santos had secretly taken during one of their meetings. A violation of his own principles, but one that he'd felt compelled to document in case the truth ever needed to be revealed. Michael stared at the picture of David Brennan, a man in his 30s with the exact physical description that Mrs. Hartwell had provided, and felt the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to click into place. He confessed to approaching Timothy during the party, said he'd been watching the boy for weeks, planning something terrible, Father Santos continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But he claimed that at the last moment, he couldn't go through with it, that he'd changed his mind and let Timothy go back to the party. The priest's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Michael. "I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that no harm had come to your brother. But deep down, I knew he was lying about something." Michael felt the familiar rage building in his chest, but this time it was tempered by something else. A cold, calculating fury that came from finally having a target for all the years of helpless searching. He studied the photograph again, memorizing every detail of David Brennan's face, wondering if this was the man who had stolen his brother's life and destroyed his family's happiness. "Father, I need you to tell me everything. Every word he said, every detail you remember, every impression you had about his mental state." The priest nodded, understanding that his long-held secret was finally coming to light. And for the next hour, he recounted conversations that had taken place nearly 3 decades ago, painting a picture of a man who was struggling with dark urges and seeking absolution for sins that may have been far worse than he'd initially admitted. As Michael listened, he felt the ghost of his 7-year-old brother standing beside him, waiting for justice that was long overdue. The address in Father Santos's file led Michael to a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town, where peeling paint and broken windows told stories of dreams deferred and lives abandoned. According to the building manager, David Brennan had moved out in December 1993, just 3 months after Timothy's disappearance, leaving no forwarding address and owing 2 months' rent. Michael climbed the creaking stairs to apartment 3B, his heart pounding with each step as he imagined what secrets might be hiding behind the door that had once been Brennan's home. The current tenant, a young mother with tired eyes and a baby on her hip, let him inside and showed him to a closet where the previous resident had left behind a small box of personal items. "The landlord said to throw it away, but I never got around to it," she explained, gesturing to a cardboard box covered in dust and cobwebs. Seemed wrong to just toss someone's belongings without knowing their story. Inside the box, Michael found a collection of items that made his blood run cold. Photographs of children playing in various neighborhood parks, carefully organized by date and location, with notes written in the margins about their daily routines, and the times they were typically unsupervised. There were newspaper clippings about Timothy's disappearance, including articles that had never been released to the public, suggesting that Brennan had maintained some connection to the investigation, even after moving away. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a small red toy car. The same car that Timothy had been holding when he was last seen alive. Michael's hands shook as he held the toy, remembering how his brother had carried it everywhere, making engine noises and creating elaborate stories about the adventures they would have together. The car was evidence, proof that Brennan had been closer to Timothy than he'd admitted to Father Santos, and possibly proof that the priest's suspicions about the confession had been correct. Michael's next stop was the county records office, where he spent hours searching through property transfers, court documents, and death certificates, trying to trace David Brennan's movements over the past 28 years. The trail was frustratingly sparse. A few traffic violations, a bankruptcy filing in 1998, and then nothing until 2015, when Brennan's name appeared on a death certificate from a hospital in Cincinnati. The cause of death was listed as liver failure, complicated by years of alcoholism, and the file noted that he died alone with no known relatives or friends to claim his body. Michael felt a mixture of disappointment and relief wash over him, as he realized that the man who had likely killed his brother was beyond the reach of earthly justice. But the knowledge also brought a strange sense of closure that he hadn't expected. David Brennan had spent his final years drinking himself to death, possibly tormented by the guilt of what he'd done to an innocent 7-year-old boy. The hospital in Cincinnati still had Brennan's personal effects in storage, and Michael made the 3-hour drive with a sense of grim determination, knowing that this might be his last chance to find answers about what had really happened to Timothy. The social worker who had handled Brennan's case remembered him as a deeply troubled man who had spoken often about a terrible mistake he'd made years earlier. But she'd assumed he was referring to his drinking problem or his estrangement from his family. Among his belongings, she showed Michael a worn leather journal filled with rambling entries about guilt, redemption, and the faces of children that haunted his dreams. On the final page, written in shaky handwriting that suggested the author was either drunk or dying, was a confession that made Michael's heart stop. "I took the boy to the quarry. I never meant for it to happen. God forgive me. The water was so cold." Michael sat in his car in the hospital parking lot, the journal clutched in his hands as he tried to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The old limestone quarry had been searched immediately after Timothy's disappearance, but the water was deep and murky, and the divers had found nothing in their limited search efforts. Now, with Brennan's confession pointing them to a specific location, Michael knew they would have to return to the quarry with better equipment, and the knowledge that they were looking for remains, rather than a missing person. He pulled out his phone and called the state police, requesting assistance from their underwater recovery team, then sat in silence as the weight of 28 years of uncertainty finally began to lift from his shoulders. Timothy's story was almost over, but the hardest part, telling his parents that their son was never coming home, still lay ahead. The limestone quarry looked smaller than Michael remembered from his childhood, but no less ominous as the morning. Mist rose from its dark waters like spirits escaping from a watery grave. The state police dive team had arrived before dawn, their equipment, trucks, and boats creating a surreal scene of modern technology invading a place that had remained unchanged for decades. Michael stood on the rocky shore, watching the divers disappear beneath the surface, each descent bringing them closer to answers that part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The water was impossibly cold, even in September, and he couldn't stop thinking about his 7-year-old brother's final moments, alone and afraid in this desolate place where children used to dare each other to swim during hot summer days. The quarry had been off-limits for years now, surrounded by chain-link fencing and warning signs, but in 1993, it had been just another playground for adventurous kids who didn't understand the danger lurking beneath the deceptively calm surface. 3 hours into the search, one of the divers surfaced with a signal that made Michael's heart skip. They'd found something. The recovery process was painstakingly slow, involving underwater cameras and careful excavation of the sediment that had accumulated over nearly 3 decades. When the small bundle finally emerged from the water, wrapped in what remained of a Superman cape, Michael felt his knees buckle as 28 years of hoping and praying and searching suddenly crystallized into this moment of terrible clarity. The medical examiner would need to conduct tests to confirm the identity, but Michael knew with absolute certainty that they'd found Timothy, and that his little brother's long journey home was finally beginning. The cape had somehow survived the years underwater, its bright colors faded but still recognizable. And Michael remembered how Timothy had insisted on wearing it to the party, because he wanted to be brave like his favorite superhero. The news of Timothy's discovery spread through the small town like wildfire, bringing reporters, curious onlookers, and a flood of memories that had been carefully buried for decades. Michael's parents flew in from Arizona, where they'd moved after retirement, and the reunion was both heartbreaking and healing as they stood together at the quarry's edge, finally able to grieve for their lost son in a way that closure had never before allowed. Mrs. Hartwell attended the small memorial service that the family held at the quarry, her walker tapping against the rocky ground as she approached the makeshift shrine of flowers and teddy bears that had appeared overnight. "I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she whispered to Michael, her weathered hands shaking as she placed a single red rose among the growing collection of tributes. "I was afraid, and my fear kept your family from having peace for so many years." Father Santos conducted a brief blessing ceremony at the quarry, his voice carrying across the still water as he spoke about redemption, forgiveness, and the eternal nature of love that transcends death. The service was simple but profound, with no formal eulogies or elaborate rituals, just a community coming together to acknowledge a tragedy that had shaped all of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. Michael found himself thinking about David Brennan during the ceremony, wondering if the man who had taken Timothy's life had ever imagined that his final confession would lead to this moment of healing and resolution. The journal entries had revealed a deeply troubled individual who had struggled with impulses he couldn't control, but they had also shown someone who was capable of remorse, and who had spent his final years tormented by the knowledge of what he'd done. As the sun began to set over the quarry, casting long shadows across the water that had held Timothy's secrets for so long, Michael felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and grief that had defined his adult life. The case was officially closed now, with DNA evidence confirming Timothy's identity, and Brennan's journal providing a detailed account of what had happened on that September afternoon in 1993. Justice had been served in a way that Michael had never expected, not through a courtroom trial or a prison sentence, but through the simple act of bringing his brother home and allowing the truth to finally come to light. The quarry would always be a place of sadness for their family, but it was also now a place of resolution, where questions that had haunted them for decades had finally been answered. 6 months later, Michael stood in the cemetery where Timothy had been laid to rest, reading the inscription on the small granite headstone. "Timothy James Chen, beloved son and brother, forever 7, forever in our hearts." The grave was surrounded by toys and flowers that the community had left as tokens of remembrance, and Michael often found himself coming here when he needed to feel close to his brother, or when the weight of his daily responsibilities as a police officer became too heavy to bear alone. The healing process had been slow and difficult, involving therapy sessions, family counseling, and the gradual reconstruction of relationships that had been damaged by years of unresolved grief. His parents had decided to move back to town, wanting to be closer to Timothy's final resting place, and they'd found a small house just a few blocks from the cemetery where they could visit their son whenever they needed to feel his presence. The revelation of Timothy's fate had also led to the reopening of several other cold cases involving missing children, as investigators wondered if David Brennan might have been responsible for more than just one tragedy. Michael had volunteered to work with the state police on these cases, using his personal experience with loss and his professional training to help other families find the answers they desperately needed. The work was emotionally taxing, but it gave him a sense of purpose that went beyond his own healing, allowing him to transform his pain into something that could help others navigate their own journeys through grief and uncertainty. Each case he worked on reminded him of Timothy, but also of the importance of never giving up hope, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Mrs. Hartwell had become an unexpected ally in Michael's efforts to help other families, using her network of elderly neighbors and longtime residents to gather information about suspicious activities that might have been overlooked by younger investigators. Her guilt over remaining silent about Timothy's disappearance had motivated her to become an advocate for missing children, and she'd started a support group for family members who were dealing with unresolved cases. The group met weekly in the basement of St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Father Santos provided spiritual guidance, and Mrs. Hartwell offered the kind of practical wisdom that comes from having lived through decades of community changes. Michael often attended these meetings, not as a detective, but as someone who understood the unique pain of not knowing what had happened to a loved one. The small town had also changed in subtle but significant ways since Timothy's case had been resolved, with residents becoming more aware of the importance of speaking up when they witnessed suspicious behavior. The local school district had implemented new safety protocols for events involving children, and the police department had established a cold case unit specifically dedicated to missing person investigations. Michael had been promoted to lead this unit, and he'd made it his mission to ensure that no family would have to wait 28 years for answers the way his had. The work was challenging, often involving cases that seemed hopeless, and families who had given up on ever finding closure. But Michael approached each investigation with the same determination that had driven him to become a police officer in the first place. As he walked away from Timothy's grave on this crisp autumn morning, Michael felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for most of his adult life. The anger that had once consumed him had been replaced by something deeper and more sustainable, a commitment to justice that honored his brother's memory while helping other families find their own paths to healing. The mystery of Timothy's disappearance had been solved, but the impact of that solution continued to ripple through the community, creating connections between people who had never spoken before, and inspiring acts of courage and compassion that might never have happened otherwise. Michael knew that Timothy would have been proud of the man he'd become, and of the way their family's tragedy had been transformed into a force for good in the world. The birthday party that had ended in such darkness had somehow, through the persistence of love and the power of truth, led to a kind of light that would continue to shine for generations to come.